It's no secret that the relationship we have with our parents plays a big role in shaping us. For better and for worse, they help form us into the people we become. But what happens when the apple falls far from the tree? We'll put the relationship between parent and child under the microscope. Tonight on the agenda.
Funding for The Agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Ontario's more than 80,000 chartered professional accountants. Public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at cpaontario.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
Kevin Newman has had an impressive career in broadcast journalism. However, while he was busy building that career, he and his son Alex were growing apart. Then, when Alex told his father he was gay, it forced the two men to examine their relationship. It's all documented in a new book called All Out: A Father and Son Confront the Hard Truths That Made Them Better Men. And we welcome Alex Newman and Kevin Newman to TVO. It's okay, this is just freaky. I'm going to start right off the top by saying it's freaky. First of all, he's mini-me, right? He is so like it. Look how you two are sitting right now.
In many ways, yeah. All right, I'll do something different.
You look the same. I mean, I've known you since you were his age.
Yes, you have.
So
Yeah.
the similarities are just crazy here. And the funny thing is, I'm talking to Alex Newman and Kevin Newman, but your first name isn't really Alex, and your first name isn't really Kevin.
That's true.
So should we get that established off the top? What's your first name?
It's John.
And what's his first name?
John. My grandfather was John.
Yes.
Irish immigrant who came to Toronto, and we have saddled each other with going by our middle names for the rest of our lives, which in the computer generation is just an annoyance.
Yes.
It is indeed. All right. I've known you a long time, but I don't know you that well, so I want to start with you.
Great.
What are your earliest memories of having a dad on TV?
Some of the earliest ones are of him in the television, and I was a little confused as to my father being trapped in this weird box in our living room. But the first real memory of my dad, and I say real because the television was always this barrier between us, was when it was in Edmonton, and he had come back from assignment, and he had brought me a gift, and it was a little toy car, little race car, and I remember him coming through the door, and I had this moment of, oh. There's this guy, it's his relative, it's dad, and but I didn't understand that he was my father. I didn't have the closeness with him that the other kids in the neighborhood did.
How old do you think you were at this point?
I was 3.
3 years old. Mm-hmm. You said the television was a barrier between the two of you. What does that mean?
In many senses, I mean, when I was a kid, it was the thing that kept him away, and it was the thing that sort of broke us apart. As I grew up, television was something that always kept Dad traveling. Doing amazing things, and having him sort of become a star and a superhero in my mind. But at the same time, I lacked a closeness.
At school, was it a cool thing to have a dad who was on TV?
To some of the teachers, yeah.
How about to your friends?
Not so much, and I think it was part of the recourse of my bullying. Being a part of it, where teachers would give me special attention, or they would say, "Oh my gosh, I love your father," and it actually became something that I wanted to hide from people that I met, just because it became such an overbearing topic in classrooms or with people I would first meet.
How much of any of this were you aware of as you were out there trying to build your career, traveling all over the place, doing your thing?
Almost none of it, to be honest. I mean, I was always aware of the distance and regretted it. I can't think of a time when, I wasn't in a cab or I wasn't in a plane and I'd look out the window and think, what am I doing? Like, I'm going away from my family so often. But this was a time in media when media had money, and there was a lot of travel, and you would go places a lot. And it was the job. And we were a single income family. My wife and I made the decision that if we could, she gave up her career in journalism to raise Alex and Erica. So, I didn't have much choice, really.
Because you felt, I got to be the provider.
Yeah, and I had to be the provider. That was sort of the agreement we had. And if you're lucky enough to be in that position, I mean, you're lucky enough to know that as you are looking out the airplane window, that there's, somebody with your child that you trust absolutely. So,
the home you came from, Your folks split up at a certain point, eh?
They did at 14, yeah. I grew up in Mississauga, and my parents divorced at 14, and my mother went back to work at that point. She'd been an at-home mom as well.
And your wife also, her parents split up.
Yeah.
Okay.
We beat the odds so far.
Well, I was going to say, so the one thing that the two of you do know is that you want to be together and you want to stay together and you don't want to have what happened to your parents happen to you.
Right.
So what, I'm not sure what the question here is, other than you basically did everything that you're not supposed to do to have a good marriage and have a good family life. And by that I mean, you're on planes and you're traveling and you're away all the time.
Yeah.
So how did that make any sense exactly?
Committed to each other as partners, committed to each other as friends. You know, sometimes when we have these periods now where I'm at home more, sometimes we look at each other and we go, okay, that's how we stay together because we weren't together all the time. I don't know. Just a dedication. You know what, I think what it might have been was that when we found each other as a couple, that feeling that we lost through divorce, that feeling of being settled and family came back to us. And then when we had Alex, it was like that feeling that I remember as a child of feeling safe in the backseat of your parents' car again. And we didn't want to let it go easily.
You didn't have the kinds of difficulties establishing a relationship with your daughter, who's younger than Alex,
Right.
than you did with him. So what's the theory there?
I put way more expectations on my son than I did my daughter. I got to know my daughter as a person. I didn't do what I think many men do, particularly to their sons, is I didn't load onto her the expectations of, okay, Alex, I need your life to be better than mine. I need your life to, I need you to have lots of friends, because I didn't. So all the expectations landed on Alex's shoulders. He was also the first child, and I think we think about it more as the first child.
He's a firstborn and he's a son, and therefore...
Right.
And did you feel the weight of those expectations growing up as his son?
I did. Yeah, I did. And I think it was part of one of the miscommunications throughout the book and throughout our story is that every move my dad would make to try and make me, I guess better in a sense, it's not really the right word, but you know, if you were bullied as a kid, you tried to stop me from being bullied as a kid or have friends that are into sports. And so you would project onto me, hey, maybe you should try sports. But I interpreted it as, Dad doesn't get me. Like, I don't like sports. How many times have I said this to him? And yet he keeps enrolling me in all these sports activities. So from his point of view, he's trying to help me. From my point of view, he doesn't get me.
I do have to say, I love the book, incidentally. It is a lovely book. You two have done a very nice job on it. And we should just explain that you write a chapter, it goes back and forth. And what's fascinating about it is when you talk about the same events, completely different interpretation of those events. Mm-hmm. How did you two get so offside from each other, in your view? I know his view. What's your view of how you two got so disconnected over the years?
I mean, I think it was that lack of closeness that I had with my mother. I was really close to my mom. She was there all the time, and she was sort of my backbone, my support. And when it came to Dad, I didn't quite understand that Dad had any weaknesses or any failings. So when I get a bad grade, when I need help in school, or when I was bullied, I had no channel to communicate that with him. So I would just bottle it up. It would be almost shameful. So I think that was the beginning of this divide that grew between us and the sort of silence that existed. And I didn't really understand the full extent to it until, to be honest, we finished writing the book. I thought I knew the right side of the story. And as I was writing, I kept that point of view intact. But then once we exchanged the manuscripts and I was able to see what was behind the scenes of Kevin Newman, which is a little bit weird because I'm his son and you'd think I'd know that, I learned a whole new guy.
Well, let's do one, perhaps the best example in the book of how the two of you were disconnected was the whole Good Morning America thing. Now, I got to tell you, from a guy sitting in this chair who's worked his whole professional life in Southern Ontario, you hit the mother load. I mean, people like me were very proud of the fact that you got that gig. And now I'm reading the book, and the whole thing, almost from the get-go, is a disaster. Mm-hmm. Why didn't it work in your view?
I wasn't ready for that level, frankly. I didn't know myself well enough. I didn't know what to stand up for or to. And so that's the stuff I'll take. It's never one answer, right? And at that point, there was also the issue, they had put someone in charge of it that had never been a programmer. They put a marketer in charge of the program. So he didn't know how to tinker with a show. He didn't know how to bring out a talent. He knew how to focus group it and suggest, you know, get rid of the glasses, change your hair, that'll fix everything.
What did they do to your eyebrows?
I did it to my eyebrows. I got to take that on too. The suggestion was that because behind my glasses you can't see my eyes very well, that one of the things I should attempt to do is like punch out my eyes. So they suggested I go dye my eyelashes. And at that point, I mean, now I would go like, really, you think that's the problem? But you know, I wasn't even 40, and I was unsure and I was insecure. So I'd never dye my eyelashes. I saw the place around the corner that somebody came on and put it on my eyelashes, and it was way too heavy, and I looked like a drag queen, and I was ashamed, right? But it was my breaking point. It was at that point that I thought, you know, they just don't know what to do themselves to fix this.
But the amazing thing about hearing you describe the events of that time is that it sounds like there's almost no journalism involved in that job, and it's all, you know, focus groups and showbiz and be more like Matt Lauer and
yeah.
And I mean, I know you're a journalist.
Yeah.
So how do you? I mean,
well, that was the misfit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the show. All shows, sort of morning shows, they go back and forth. You do need some journalistic chops because you do interview the Secretary of State of the United States occasionally. So that's why I was brought in, because I did have that gravitas. But then the producers of the show at the time didn't require that. They were going much softer. And so my strength didn't really get played to. And I had to learn a set of skills that I'm not particularly comfortable with. I'm not great at a dinner party. I can interject, I can interview. But I'm not much fun at a dinner party. You need to be fun at a dinner party to do morning television.
Now here's where the two of you again were very disconnected, because of course all over the tabloids is your rise and fall on that program, which lasted what? How long was it?
8 months. I was on as co-host. Yeah.
Of Good Morning America, and you don't know anything about this.
I don't. I actually had a bullying incident that told me. I had a bully come up to me and he said, "Oh, I heard your dad got fired." And I thought he was just razzing me at school, and he said, "Oh, well, now you're going to get deported." And so I thought, you know, it was just some like, you know, he's just pulling on my Canadian string and whatever, you know, I'll just ignore it. But he was right. Which
Alex, see, this is one of the things that I learned in the book. I didn't know that Alex didn't know until we actually moved home to Vancouver.
Yeah.
And that was like months later. But one of the things I think I did, and maybe some fathers do, is you don't burden your children with this stuff. That's the way I was brought up, right? You're heroic. You don't, like, if you have adult worries, you shield your children from it. But I mean, you know, you were in high school at that time, and I was still acting as if, you know, I needed to protect my children from, you know, what was actually going on.
But the fact is, you left that job and you went to Nightline, and you worked on Peter Jennings's World News Tonight as well. So you could easily be forgiven for thinking, my dad didn't get fired. In fact, he might have got promoted. He's working on a better show now.
And that was my perception growing up, that dad was always moving on to something better. So I never knew that half of your jobs were
Rescue operations.
Yeah.
Now, during the course of all of this, so you're traveling all over the place. You're up here, you're down in New York, then you come back. Eventually, you set up the new evening newscast at Global Television. Do you have any inkling at all about your son's sexual orientation?
No. The only time I had an inkling was when he was 17. It was a few months before he came out. And we had grown apart. Alex had grown distant. Not unusual for teenage boys to lock themselves in their rooms and not communicate. So one of the things I thought is, okay, I'm going to make an effort here. I've got the time, I've got the resources. So we went to Japan together. Alex was taking Japanese. He was very interested in anime. I thought, okay, let's put something together that's his passions, and I'll be the student, you be the teacher. And so we went to Japan, and we were in Nara there for a day, and you know, probably finally got sick of each other and said, let's just go off and do our own thing. Well, Alex didn't know at the time, but I was spying on him just to make sure he was safe, because
Always a journalist.
or a dad, I don't know what it is.
Because you're how old at the time? You're 17 or so?
Yeah,
17.
Okay.
So I noticed that the Japanese girls, he was a head turner. And I also noticed that he didn't turn his head. There was no recognition of what was happening, and you didn't notice. So that's the first time and the only time that I thought, wonder.
Your side of the story.
It took a while. It took a long time, and I wish it was an answer that I could have come up with myself. And I remember there was a summer before I came out where I was just tortured with this notion of I don't feel normal. Something's off, and I don't know who I am. But I didn't have the answer at the time. I was had to find it from outside of myself. I had to actually experience what it was like to be with a guy to understand that that's what I liked. I had a girlfriend at the time. She was really patient with me. And there were little hints along the way.
Well,
so
you call her girlfriend, but you guys didn't kiss, you didn't...
We did, we kissed. I'll leave it at that. And but it was every night, if we go out on a date, when I drop her off at her house, there was always this moment of, oh, now I gotta kiss her in the car. Oh, what am I gonna do? And I kind of get it finished with quickly and sort of boot her out the car, and that was it. And I feel bad for her to this day, because I mean, she must have thought I didn't like her or something, but it wasn't about her personality, it was just the whole sex.
Did you ever circle back with her and say, it wasn't you, it was me?
Yeah, and that's a conversation we had at the time when I broke up with her, and I actually ended up sending her a copy of the book, and we've had some email exchanges back and forth. And,
oh, nice.
You know, it's really, we have a good relationship.
How much of your trying to come out was problematic because I'm Kevin Newman's son and I don't know how to tell Kevin Newman about all of this?
That's a great way to put it, because that dad was this entity in my life that I didn't know, well, first off, how to communicate failure to him. So there's right out of the gate, you know, every kid deals with failure, but if you can't communicate it to your dad, there's a big barrier there.
I'm going to stop you there. Why would coming out constitute a failure in your eyes?
At the time, I was really naked, and I was afraid that Dad would see my coming out as a failure. Not that it was a failure of my own personality, that that he might not accept me, that he might not accept gay lifestyle, boyfriends, and I feared that I would be cast away. I feared that Dad would prioritize his career, and I would be a blemish on the family.
Did he give you any reason to feel that way?
Not individually, not as a person, but there were moments as I was growing up that I saw his disapproval of sort of gay culture in general. So for instance, we'd be watching a TV show and two guys would be holding hands, and he'd be like, oh no, I can't watch that. And he would change the channel. And it was little things that I caught as a child that even though I didn't know I was gay, I was searching for approval or disapproval from both of my parents along that timeline. So I had all of this knowledge that, okay, Dad doesn't really approve of this. I don't know where he stands on the topic, so when I come out to him, I have to understand the risk that he might see this as a negative, and I might lose that unconditional love that I've always had in my family.
So that's the backstory that you presumably at the time did not know. Mm-hmm. From your point of view, did he have any reason to fear coming out to you?
No, I mean, I have gay friends. I've worked alongside gay men and women in my business. You know, I think the thing that hurts the most when I read it was that my own son didn't believe that my love for him was unconditional, that he believed it was conditional. So that's an enormous failure on my part, that I wasn't able to communicate that to him and that he didn't believe it. And he's right. There were times when I watched television and I would get uncomfortable and just wasn't there. And so over time, what I've come to realize is that, you know, I found it very easy to accept Alex and defend him to the world. But when Alex would, you know, reach out to me and invite me to some gay clubs for celebrations and things, I was always very subtly aware that, or maybe not so subtly aware, that I was in a gay club, and these were gay men in a gay club. And they weren't like, you know, firefighters, they weren't, you know, office guys, they were gay guys at a gay club. Mm. And that to me is homophobia. That's still homophobia because I'm just not completely accepting and embracing of the culture. And so, you know, I think that was my journey that began that day.
You, after dinner one night, call a family conference. And this is the moment when you're going to tell everybody, and you're finally going to make this official. Mm-hmm. How did you negotiate within your own head how to do all that?
Well, by that point in time, I had pretty much figured out who I was. I had an answer, and I was very aware that my family needed to know about it. And I had two choices at that time. I was about to go away to college in Ontario, and we were living in BC at the time. So I was thinking, okay, I could either wait till I'm far away and, you know, drop the bomb and, you know, just hope everything's all right, or I can tell them before I go away and try to see how the family reacts.
Would it have been easier to do it later, right?
It would have been
easier to send them an email or just say.
Would have been easy, yeah, just a text message.
So
by the way,
why didn't you do that?
Because they deserve to know the real me. They deserve to know who I really was and who I discovered myself to be. And I owed it to my family to do that. And I owed it to myself to get them to know me. So yeah, it was Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving, where I called the family meeting after dinner, and usually that's a pretty foreboding thing to do. It's never really good news. It's usually we're moving, or mom's not well, or something of that nature. So I know you were nervous. Mom was nervous. Erica, my sister, she already knew. I told her in the car on the way home, picking her up from school, and she didn't know what to do with me because I was just a sobbing mess beside her, and I don't think she's ever seen me cry before. And then we sat down, and I struggled to get the 3 words out that would basically change how my parents saw me forever, and that is that I am gay.
I'm going to read an excerpt, Alex, because you didn't struggle to get the words out. It was way beyond that. Here we go. From All Out, a wail came from deep inside him. This is Kevin describing his son. A primal and barely human sound I've only heard once before in a refugee camp in Kosovo. You'd hear it late at night, this wave of sorrow and loss passing from one tent to the next. Hearing that same sound coming from my child was terrible, and I lunged toward him, hugging him tighter than I ever had. Kevin, I can only imagine what that moment was like for you. How did you handle watching your son fall apart like that?
I was terrified. I mean, at that point, I didn't know what he wanted to tell us, for sure. But he was so vulnerable, so frightened. It was interesting because it was almost like a physical thing inside of him that I knew something massive was about to come out of him, and I just went into protection mode.
You hugged him like you've never hugged him before.
Yeah, I wouldn't let him go because he was struggling.
He wanted to get away from you.
Yeah, no, he was struggling. He was angry, and I remember thinking to myself, if I let go at this moment, what will that mean? Like, how will he interpret it? Will he mean that I'll let you go? Or so what I said in my own mind, and I remember thinking this very clearly, is don't let go. He has to feel this. He's resisting it, but he has to feel it.
And as he was doing that, what was going through your head?
I was thinking, I know my dad has the ability to, work in television, and he has a very on personality, and I wasn't sure if Dad was just saying the right thing at the time, just to make sure I don't completely collapse or astray from the family. So I wasn't sure if he was being honest.
You felt I was bullying you almost.
Almost.
Yeah.
You doubted his sincerity.
I did.
So the hug for you was not a sincere gesture to connect with you.
It didn't seem to be at the time. And I mean, looking in hindsight, of course he accepted me as his son, but would he accept my partners? Would he accept the culture that I'm, going to be in? I wasn't sure at the time, and I wasn't sure what he knew.
In fairness, you pushed a bit there, eh?
I did.
Like a lot of public displays of affection and very,
I did.
Now, did you do that to sort of get under his skin a bit? Was that part of the agenda there?
I did it to test him, and the tests were unfortunately unfair. And I think as every adolescent goes through a phase of discovering themselves, they test their parents. And I put up walls and barriers that Dad could never overcome. For instance, making out with my boyfriend in front of him. I mean, I don't care like if you're gay, straight, bi, kids making out in front of their parents, and to the degree that I was just inappropriate. Exactly. So, but I had him at a point where he couldn't say stop because it would have legitimized my suspicions of his approval.
You had to prove you were not homophobic by letting him carry on like that in front of you.
Yes. And my wife and I had like very frank conversations about this. I mean, if you fear that, I mean, your child is going to have sex, and if your child is gay, you want to make sure that they're in the safest place possible for that. So our children were in the bedroom in our house a lot sooner than I had thought they would be, but that's one of the things you do. I mean, you have to adjust.
Let's bring this, can we please, this photo up. Look over the monitor over my shoulder here. Okay, what's going on in this picture?
There's a lot going on in that picture. That's the day after I came out. Dad had set up a family photo shoot, and he didn't cancel it. We debated it. We actually sat down and talked about this after I came out, and you said, you want me to not do this? And I'm glad we went ahead, because it captures this moment in time where I can see my face and I know I'm forcing a smile. But for some reason, I don't know how the photographer captured it. In every shot, there's kind of this loneliness to me. There's like, you see Mom and Erica around Dad, and I'm kind of recessed. And I don't know if maybe that was just in my own head, but it's quite telling.
It is interesting that he's sort of at the back.
And this, yeah, at the side.
Now, it's possible that that's just the way it worked out. It's also possible to infer that he's somehow being marginalized here.
Yeah, I remember that photo shoot that day. And I mean, sometimes people are marginalized, they self-marginalize too. And I think there was some of that going on. It was an awkward situation. Alex had just said the most private thing in his life, and here was a photographer with a camera. So, you know, I'm not sure I wouldn't have, I mean, I shrank back a bit too. I mean, I felt exposed, but we also felt that to not go ahead after such important news would send the wrong signal that, you know, we are still a family. You are still my son. We will still hold together. But that picture ended up telling, you know, probably the subtext of that day anyway.
Here's another excerpt from the book. Bear hugging Alex on that Thanksgiving day in 2004, I had no idea how much I would have to evolve in order to become the father I wanted to be to both my children. I thought my acceptance of Alex at that moment was all that mattered, but I'd underestimated the distance between us or the ways he felt I'd failed him in the years leading up to that moment. Evolve, that's an interesting choice of word there. What are you trying to say by using the word evolve?
That point in our relationship was the point where the power between us changed. I think a lot of men as fathers sort of hang on to, I'm top dog. You will, you know, continue to respect my values, respect my will, respect my rules. Alex, as a man, said, rules have changed. You now have to get to know me. You now have to pass my tests. And I think in any relationship with a parent and child, sometimes you leave that realization too late. That you know, it is their world now. Alex, because he was you know, came out at a young age. I think we reached that point earlier. But I had a very clear indication. This is, you know, this is why I respect him as a man too. He threw the gauntlet down and he said, "Yeah, I want you in my life, but the rules are mine now."
How would you rate his evolution?
Oh, Titanic. I mean, it took like it took a long time, and there were little steps along the way where I saw him make progress. One of the instances was walking down Church Street in Toronto, and these two guys walk by holding hands, and you pause after they pass, and you said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't care," and it was this beautiful, like, it was a small revelation, but it was so beautiful that Kevin of the past would have noticed and sort of felt either uncomfortable or
Probably wouldn't have said anything.
Probably wouldn't have said anything, but the fact that you recognize that you had made progress, and that was ages ago, that was years ago, but you know, up until now, like, he's a different man.
He didn't flinch.
No, I mean, now he's come out as a true self in this book, and I think it's amazing.
Now, when you say he's come out, do you mean in the way that you've come out, or are we talking about a different come out?
Well, I mean, everybody associates coming out with LGBT, but I think it's a broader topic. I think coming out is being truthful to who you are, and in this book, my dad has come out.
Interesting. He wrote about you in this book, "I don't know anyone, straight or gay, who's as close to his father as I am to mine."
Yeah,
like,
slave.
you do know that
Yeah.
that's as good as it gets if you're a parent, eh? You know
Unbelievable. And the process of reading that line, I mean, Alex and I had exchanged our manuscripts, and he left the last chapter out, which is where that's from. And he came over to our house, and he said, "I actually want to watch you guys read this chapter." And so my wife and I sat there, and I got to the very end, and it was like, wow, yeah, it's huge. It really is huge.
Kevin, you do also talk about this near the end of the book, and that is journalists are never supposed to be the story. And you are very much the story here. And I wonder whether, despite all the good this book will do, and it will do a lot of good, this is going to open a lot of people's eyes, any qualms about putting the spotlight on yourself in this way?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm very comfortable shining the spotlight on others. But And, you know, there's a legitimate discussion in journalism about whether someone in my position should be declaring themselves on the issue of same-sex rights. So you know, when in the process of writing the book, I went to my news executives and I said, this is something I want to do. Are you comfortable with it? They were completely supportive. But then I read a book, David Brinkley's biography of Walter Cronkite. And in there, and I didn't go looking for this, I was just enjoying the book, but the entire team at CBS News during the civil rights movement reached that same point where they said, no, this isn't a question of balance, this is a question of human rights. And they made a very conscious effort, and it caused them, some of their affiliates, to drop out of the CBS network. But they made a very conscious effort to say, no, we are actually going to approach this story from the point of view of advocacy. And when I read that about Walter Cronkite and the greats of journalism, I found tremendous comfort, because I feel the same way about this issue, that there's no way you can explain to me that my daughter has more rights in this society than my son does.
Let's end up with this. What would you like people to take away from reading this book?
There's a lot to take away from this book, and I know our crisis in our family focuses on the LGBT aspect of my life, but I think that I'd love parents and kids to take away from this that be open to conversation. If every kid's going to go through a growth period, they try to understand, who they are. And if you stay open as a parent, if you're there and you're open to whatever they have to say to you, then it's gonna be a lot smoother. It's gonna be a lot smoother.
I love a book with a happy ending. Congratulations, you two. It's a lovely story, well told.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming into TVO tonight. Up next, how families are embracing difference and diversity right after this. Author Andrew Solomon spent nearly a decade speaking to parents who were nurturing children far different from themselves. Those conversations came together in his book, Far from the Tree: Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity. We spoke with him back in 2012, and here's part of that conversation. You always wanted to be a parent, and now you are. Yes. How many kids have you, this is a complicated question, so let's go through this. How many children do you have?
So the answer I always have to give on that is it depends on how you count.
Exactly.
And I'll give you the sort of family story in as condensed a version as I can.
Okay.
My husband, John, who I've been with for 11 years, in the period before he met me, had some lesbian friends who asked him to be a sperm donor, and they created a son, Oliver. Tammy and Laura created Oliver.
You got the picture up there. Do you want to say who's who?
Oliver is the one in the red shirt who is sitting with my husband's arm over his shoulder.
Okay.
So Tammy and Laura produced Oliver. John was not the father, he was just the donor. Oliver was supposed to call him Donor Dad, but because he couldn't quite get that, he ended up calling him Donut Dad.
Donut Dad, all right.
A few years later, after John and I had met, Tammy and Laura asked him to be a donor again, and they produced Lucy, whose lovely picture we're looking at now. Mm-hmm. And so then they had those two children. And in the meanwhile, I had a very close friend from college who had for a long time who had been married, and her marriage had ended in divorce. And I said to her, "Are you sad about being divorced?" And she said, "No, I'm only sad about the idea of not having children." And I said, "Well, you'd be the best mother in the world, so if you ever decide you want some, I'd be game to be the father." It never occurred to me that she would take me up on it. She lived in a world in which I didn't think it was likely. She was in the American Southwest in Texas. But a few years later, she came up for my 40th birthday party in New York, and she said, "You know what? I think this might be a good idea." And we realized that was what we both really wanted to do. So we have Blaney, and there we are with Blaney. And then John and I felt that it would be lovely for us to have a child who lived with us all the time. And so we decided to do that. We decided that I would be the biological father because I was the one who had really pushed for another child. John was less sure about it all. We found an egg donor through an agency, and then Laura, the mother of Oliver and Lucy, offered to be our surrogate and to carry George. And there we are with George when he was 17 days old, I think, in that photograph, and already holding up his head. So,
How precocious.
So Laura was our surrogate. And now, and in the process of Laura carrying that pregnancy, we got to be much closer to Tammy and Laura. The kids discovered that Blaney called us Daddy and Papa John. They wanted to call us Daddy and Papa too. So now we have these 4 children. They all call us Daddy and Papa. 5 parents, 4 children, 3 states is the kind of shorthand for it.
Where's the partridge in the pear tree?
Exactly, coming at Christmas.
Huh. Okay, that's quite a story. Now, parenthood, has it turned out to be, George is what, born in 2009? So he's still a very young kid. Has parenthood turned out to be everything that you thought it would?
You know, it's funny. When I was a little boy, I remember my mother saying, the love for your children is unlike any other experience, and people who don't have children never get to know it. And it was a great compliment, because there I was her child, and she was exalting it. When I was an adolescent, she said the same thing, and it made me really worried, because I thought, but I might not have children. When I was in my 20s, she said, the love for your children is unlike any other love, and if you don't have children, you'll never know. And it made me furious. I thought, I'm gay, I'm not going to have kids, stop saying that. And now that I have them, it turns out she was right.
She was right.
Yeah. I've loved it. I worried at the beginning. I thought, what if I don't love it? What if I do this and then I'm stuck with it forever? But I mean, they're lovely kids, but I think it's just the whole experience, the intimacy of it, the engagement. I mean, it has its ups and downs. You know, they have their temper tantrum days, but I really do love it, yeah.
How do you all make decisions about parenting?
So everyone has 2 legal parents. Tammy and Laura are the legal parents of Oliver and Lucy. Blaine and I are the legal parents of Blaney, and John and I are the legal parents of George. So all the decisions get made in conversation, but we all welcome any intelligence and perspective from the others. When it comes down to sort of finally putting the signature on the page, then it's whichever one of us is the legal parent. But we all collaborate, and we all like each other. We have a really good time together. I mean, the book just launched in New York. Everyone came to New York. We were together for 10 days. It was heaven.
I was going to say, God forbid there's a divorce in this picture here, because it's going to be insane as you guys try to, I mean, it seems complicated enough trying to figure this out with you all liking each other. And even when parents like each other, there's plenty to disagree about. Have you found that yet?
Sure. We found things that we disagree about. We found that in the 3 different households that there are some things one person does one way and another person does another way. I mean, there are always things to disagree about. But maybe I'm being foolishly optimistic, and you'll have me back on the program in 5 years and years, but I don't see us heading toward divorce. I feel like it took us a long time to figure this out, and we worked really hard to figure out how to find these relationships and how to have a family, and we worked too hard on it to just let it go.
We're now going to talk about a situation where the children are not quite so lovable, and let's move on to that. We've had a story here in Toronto this past week where the, I guess, perpetrator of a double sexual assault turned himself in. He got caught on a security camera while riding transit, and he showed up at the police station with his mother, who no doubt, like other people, saw his image on the news. Now, based on what you've learned from families where a child turns to crime, can you give us some insight into how parents process the notion that their child is a criminal?
Right. So I would begin by saying that historically, we've assigned many kinds of problems and issues to parents. We said that autism was caused by refrigerator mothers, gay people had overbearing mothers and passive fathers, people with schizophrenia had parents with a subconscious wish they not exist. If you go back 200 years, people thought that the reason for dwarfism and deformity were the unrealized lascivious longings of the mother. And we've given up on blaming the parents on all of those things, but we still blame the parents when kids are criminals. And sometimes the parents have done things which have actually contributed to the criminal behavior of children. So we're not totally wrong in that. But essentially, they're just exacerbating what's there or moderating it. A lot of the time, you just have a kid who's a criminal. And when I started working on crime, I ended up thinking it feels to me more like a disease than a lot of the so-called diseases that I'm looking at. My heart goes out to that mother. I don't know her, but it's perfectly possible, at least, that she was a kind, loving, generous mother who produced a child who did a terrible, horrific thing.
Here's an excerpt from your book, which reflects very much that which you just said. If you have a child who's a dwarf, you are not dwarfed yourself. And if your child is deaf, it does not impair your own hearing. But a child who is morally culpable seems like an indictment of mother and father. Parents whose kids do well take credit for it. And the obverse of their self-congratulation is that parents whose kids do badly must have erred. Unfortunately, virtuous parenting is no warranty against corrupt children. Yet these parents find themselves morally diminished, and the force of blame impedes their ability to help, sometimes even to love, their felonious progeny. Let's get into one of the, very nicely written, incidentally.
Thank you.
I told you already, you're a great writer.
Thank you.
Gandhi said, of course, hate the sin, not the sinner. What if your kid is responsible for the massacre at Columbine High School? How do you not hate the sinner as well?
So I spent a lot of time with Tom and Sue Klebold, whose son Dylan Klebold was one of the perpetrators of that massacre. And I went there thinking that when I got to know them, I would understand why this had happened. And the better I got to know them, the less I understood it. While I happen to be rather fond of my own parents, I would actually have been happy to be brought up by them. It's a lovely family. They're lovely people. We did our first long interview, which was a whole weekend. We recorded more than 20 hours of interviews, and we were all exhausted at the end of it. And we were sitting around the kitchen table having dinner. And I said, if Dylan were here now, is there anything you'd want to ask him or say to him? And his father said, there sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother kind of looked at the floor and thought for a minute, and then she looked back up and said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And I just felt that that kept coming up. And I said, it must have been hard to keep loving him when all of this happened. And she said, no. She said it was hard to understand. It was hard to forgive. It was hard to interpret. It was hard to reconcile with what I already knew. But loving him, that was always easy for me.
Andrew, I must tell you, when I read that part of the book, I thought, I don't get that. And I'm going to ask you to explain this to me. God forbid, if I ever had a kid that did anything as heinous as what that kid did, there would be a part of me that would say, I wish he'd never or she'd never been born. More likely he, boys tend to do this kind of thing. I wish he'd never been born so that those 14, 15, 16 people he killed and all of the misery that came along with it never would have happened. I would think that at some part, in some part of myself. She never does.
If she could turn back the clock and save the people who died at Columbine, she would do it in an instant, and she would give up her own life to do it. I have no question about that. She's a very moral person, and she's horrified by the suffering of others, and she talked about how painful it was. She actually wrote letters to the parents of all the children who had been killed. It was then advised not to send some of them because they might re-traumatize people, but I mean, she was horrified by it. So there's no question that if she could turn it back and prevent it from happening, she would. I think the point she was making, however, is that she loved her child, and her child, as she once said, he had some form of an illness. The same thing that killed those other people at Columbine also killed my son. And what she'd like, I think, is to be able to recreate things in a way so that he hadn't done that. But despite the fact that he did it, he was her son. He'd lived with her for many years. I mean, I don't know whether you have children. I will tell you, my children are yes, excellent. So my children are flawed. I adore them. I love them. They're flawed. I'm flawed too. One has children who are flawed, and one doesn't want to exchange them for children without those flaws.
I know, but there was no, unless I missed it, there was no part in your reportage where she said, you know, I even feel guilty that I even had the kid. She said, I have nothing but joyous memories of being a mother, and I still love the fact that I am Dylan's mother. That just felt weird to me.
I think that's not actually what
I'm
she
reading
was
too much
saying.
into that?
Yeah, I think what she said was that she was agonized by what had happened, but that she nonetheless loved her child, even though she deplored what he had done and would do anything to stop it from happening.
Can she mourn his death?
I think she has mourned his death, and I think the difficult thing is that while the parents of all the kids who were killed had to mourn their deaths, she's had to mourn his life as well.
They stayed in Columbine, eh?
Yes. I was surprised by that, and I said, why didn't you want to leave after all of this? And they said, well, you know, if we'd gone someplace else, we would have just been meeting new people. And his mother said, everyone would have met me as the mother of that killer. She said, staying here, there were people who already loved us and who we could count on. She said, and more than that, there were people who had loved Dylan, and I needed that at a time when everyone in the world hated him.
But the suggestion seems to be that whatever it was that made him do what he did, it was a disease of some kind, or it was clearly not explainable by bad parenting, because you said they were great parents. Do they or you have any added insight into what that disease might have been?
You know, I think we're at a time when brain imaging is moving forward incredibly rapidly, and I think I know that there are already some studies that show that in people who are diagnosed as psychopaths, certain areas are overactive or underactive. But I think our understanding of the brain, as one person I was talking to when I wrote the book said, is like those photos of the Earth from the moon where you can see the continents in the solar system, I mean the ocean systems, and when you can actually read the license plates, we might understand where these things come from.
Okay, let me move on to dealing with children who may seem unlovable for other reasons. And you talked to parents whose children were conceived in rape.
Yes.
What commonalities did these mothers have?
So I wanted to look at the idea that dealing with a child who is extraordinary and who appears in some sense to be possibly unlovable entails dealing with a child who's born different, with a child who turns out to be strange or different, like the criminals, and it even applies when you have a child who comes from a strange and difficult place. I saw these women, and I want to emphasize, as I have all the way through, I saw women who had kept children conceived in rape, which does not suggest that I think women who have been raped ought to keep their children. I have no judgment on that. I feel people need to decide what's right for them. But I did find that many of these women loved their children, but also that they experienced a lot of pain in connection with them. I mean, the anecdote that in a way summed it up was when I was in Rwanda, where I went to interview women who'd been raped in the genocide. And I spoke to one woman, and at the end of the interview, I said, as I often do at the end of interviews, do you have any questions for me? And in Rwanda, people had said, will this be published in French? And did you get the spelling of my name right? And how long are you staying here? And this one woman said to me, well, you're in this field of psychology, right? And I said, well, yeah, more or less. And she said, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? She said, because I want to love her so much, but when I look at her, I see what happened to me, and it gets in the way. And I was so shocked, I was just standing there. And she said it again, quite fiercely. She said, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? And it was only much later on that I thought what a loving question that was.
How did you answer it?
Like that at the time. I mean, I think I said to her, give it time, and you know, I hope you'll find healing and just build your own life and include her. I mean, I came out with banalities, but afterwards I really did think that there's that wish to love the child is very strong, and a lot of these women had babies whom they felt they couldn't love, and over time they were won over by their children because the children are people of them unto themselves. Mm-hmm. They aren't just the rapist reincarnated.
I guess part of the problem is if you're a victim of rape, there's a group for that. If you're an alcoholic, there's a group for that. If you're et cetera, is there a support group for people who've decided to keep babies that have been conceived as a result of rape?
The problem is that a lot of the support, there are support groups for such people. A lot of it comes from the sort of outer fringes of the anti-abortion movement. I found that a lot of these women, there were a lot of commonalities in the experiences I heard. One of the commonalities was that most of them didn't know about one another and felt alone and lonely and isolated. And part of the reason I included the chapter was because I wanted to say, this happens a lot. There are tens of thousands of rape-conceived children born every year in the United States. I'm sure there are many born even in peaceable Canada. And these people shouldn't have to be suffering in this kind of silence, but the stigma is so huge. And there's also the complexity that you have to decide at what point you're going to tell your child that your child was conceived in rape. If you have an adopted child, you tell them about adoption from the very beginning. But rape is both too violent and too graphically sexual to describe to a very young child. So there has to be a moment of revelation, and then the decision about how you handle things really has to be made with the interests of the child at heart.
Based on your experience, when do you have that conversation?
It really varies. I mean, some kids seem to be ready for it really early, and some kids find out much later on and are traumatized. I basically would say there's never a good time for it. I mean, the average is probably mid-teenage years. But, you know, mid-teenage years can be pretty tricky even without any surprise revelations.
Would any part of you recommend that that conversation just never take place?
I think it's very difficult to grow up in the world with a secret that you might unearth at some point later on and that you've never been told. So I did talk to one survivor, I guess one child of a rape survivor. Her mother had died. She had found out what happened. She had never been able to talk to her mother about it, and she felt betrayed. So if you could keep it locked in the tomb, maybe that works, but tombs aren't well locked in this day and age.
I want to ask you about Brenda Henriquez. Is that how you pronounce her last name? She was raped as a teenager. She kept her baby. She found out her daughter was raped at almost the same age that she was. Discuss, you know? I mean, I almost don't know where to begin with that kind of circumstance.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found is that there were some people I met who were raped in what we think of as the classic someone jumps out from behind a bush kind of way. But there were lots of people who, because of early experience or because of childhood sexual abuse or for any of a variety of reasons, didn't really know how to protect themselves well and kept putting themselves in situations of vulnerability. So I met quite a few women who had been raped multiple times. Brenda was, I think, not such a person. She came from a loving and supportive family, but after she had been through the experience of being raped and having this baby at 16 when she wasn't ready and losing the life that she had really hoped and planned to have, after she'd been through that whole difficult, painful, upsetting business, she had very shaky sexual boundaries, and it took her a long time to figure things out. And it was one of her boyfriends who raped her daughter. So that was unbelievably horrific. But when I talked to her about the whole experience, I said to her, do you think about the rapists much? And she said, you know, I used to think about them with anger, but now I mostly think about them with pity. And I thought she just meant pity because they were so unevolved to do something like this. And I said, pity? And she said, yes. She said, because they have a beautiful daughter and 2 beautiful grandchildren, and they don't know it, and I do. So as it turns out, I'm the lucky one. It was an extraordinary achievement of resilience. Now, if she could remake her life, would she want to be raped at 16? Certainly not. But given that that was what had been handed to her, she was ultimately able to find peace with it.
Amazing. Do you know how that happens?
You know, I think that time is something of a healer, but what I really ended up thinking, and I looked at the ways people construct meaning in a whole lot of situations in this book, and at first I kept thinking, as you were saying about Sue Klebold, how could she possibly really love her son? Or how could this woman possibly say it's all worked out well? And I thought in the end, it doesn't matter whether those narratives are true or not. It might be that if there were genuinely a choice, people would choose to have a different life or to have things go otherwise. But if you can manage to say, I found meaning in this experience, then you can find peace with it and you can be a good parent to your child. And if you say, it's meaningless and awful and I hate it, then you're going to lead a very tortured life. So would I have been happier being straight? Who knows? Who knows who I'd have been if I'd been straight? I'd have been someone else altogether. But if I spent my entire adult life thinking, oh, if I were only like that, it would be destroyed. And in fact, I've managed now to have a very happy life that's just who I am.
Okay, moving from the unlovable child to a child not of sound mind or body, let's put it that way. You point out in Far From the Tree that raising gifted children or prodigies can be as difficult as raising a child with autism. Explain.
So the shorthand is that I think it's just as difficult to have the mind of a 25-year-old in the body of a 3-year-old as it is to have the mind of a 3-year-old in the body of a 25-year-old. And what I found with people who were dealing with children who had this really extraordinary, explosive, prodigious genius, and I focused on classical music because that's an area in which it often manifests, the parents were completely torn. Do I put my child with people who are his age peers, who can't understand a single thing he talks about? Or do I put him with people who are his intellectual peers, who are not really interested in the concerns of a 5-year-old? And so there's this constant struggle to find a context and to find a place. And essentially, the parents are confronted with a whole world of which they know nothing, and they have to become expert very quickly. And it was a lot like the experience of families of people with Down syndrome or autism in that regard.
How do parents, I think it's fair to say that parents, well, they don't want necessarily their kids to be just like them. They wouldn't mind if a little piece of their kid was a little bit like them. So how does a parent handle a situation where their offspring is really nothing at all like them, for all of the reasons we've just discussed?
Well, I think it takes a big leap of the imagination, and I think parenting altogether requires quite a lot of imagination. People essentially go into having children, by and large, with a fantasy centered around the word reproduction. Reproduction suggests that you're just making a little mini version of sort of yourself and your other half. Actually, what you're doing is producing someone, and what I found is that everyone's children are sometimes strange to them. Everyone sometimes has the experience of looking at their child or hearing about something their child did and thinking, where did you come from? And the process of reconciling oneself to that is it's a lifetime's project. And the families I mostly wrote about, some of the families I wrote about didn't, but most of them ultimately decided that they were going to embrace the children and acknowledge who they were.
What's the hardest part of parenting a child who's not at all like you?
I think the hardest part is the ignorance that you have about the child's condition, the difficulty of finding reliable information, and the feeling all the time that you're probably making a lot of mistakes. I mean, I think one of the things we often think when we're setting out to be parents is, my parents did all of these things wrong, I'm not going to do those things wrong, I'm going to be a perfect parent to my kids. But your kids aren't you, they're someone else. And so you're being the person who would have been a perfect parent to yourself actually isn't the perfect parent to your child. And when you have the children with these extreme differences, I mean, I had so many people who are full of self-blame and self-criticism, and I did this wrong and I did that wrong, and if I'd known that sooner, and we should have started that therapy, they would go on and on like that. And I think it's that guilt. I think the guilt is the hardest part. I think it can even get in the way of love.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, December 8th, 2015. Tomorrow, we'll explore 165 million square kilometers of the globe. The Pacific Ocean, the part it's played in our past and the grip it holds on our future. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Funding for the Agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Ontario's more than 80,000 chartered professional accountants. Public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at cpaontario.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.